I moved into the small apartment on Elmwood just as autumn began to settle into the quiet suburb. A seemingly ordinary decision spurred by a change in my job and the promise of a fresh start. The building was old but well maintained, with creaking floorboards and narrow hallways that hinted at stories of years past. My neighbor in apartment 3B, a man I would later come to know only through fleeting glimpses and hushed murmurs, lived directly across from mine. At first, everything felt normal. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, arranging books on shelves, and savoring the solitude that came with a fresh beginning. However, it wasn't long before I began noticing small, inexplicable details that unsettled me. Late one night, as I sat in my living room reading by a dim lamp, I distinctly heard a soft, persistent tapping against the wall, the kind that suggested a fingernail on wood or maybe a hurried, indecipherable message. I attributed it to the building's age and dismissed it as a quirk of the old structure. But then I began to see a pattern. On several nights, I caught fleeting silhouettes in the hallway outside my door, and each time, a figure, always too still, too deliberate, would slip around the corner of apartment 3B. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than a nocturnal wanderer or another tenant with an erratic sleep schedule. Yet the more I paid attention, the more I realized these occurrences were synchronized with other inexplicable phenomena. I started to notice that the lights in apartment 3B would occasionally flicker on and off at odd hours, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Once, while taking an early morning walk around the block, I saw the neighbor's curtains fluttering as if in a breeze, despite the stifling, motionless air of a late autumn day. His presence was a mystery wrapped in routine silence, and though I tried to rationalize these events, perhaps he was a light sleeper disturbed by the building's odd wiring, or maybe the city's power grid was unstable. The inconsistencies piled up. My rational mind fought to piece together the clues. A tapping that wasn't just random settling noises, a persistent movement outside my door, the eerie, almost ritualistic pattern of light and shadow emanating from across the hall. One evening, unable to quell my growing unease, I ventured a few steps into the hallway under the pretext of retrieving a forgotten notebook. As I passed apartment 3B, I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the narrow gap between the door and the wall. The neighbor's silhouette was there for an instant, too defined to be a trick of the light, and then he vanished as silently as he had appeared. I questioned my own senses, wondering if my anxiety was conjuring images of an intrusive mind. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I began keeping a careful log of the disturbances, the exact times of the tapping, the unusual flickering of lights, and even a series of muffled sounds that resembled whispered voices coming from behind closed doors. I reached out to a few other tenants, hoping to find validation in shared experience, but they either dismissed my accounts as overactive imagination or insisted that the old building naturally produced creaks and groans that could easily be misinterpreted. The tipping point came on a bitterly cold night when I awoke to an insistent scratching at my door. Heart pounding, I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but a darkened hallway. Later that same night, while reviewing the recordings I'd attempted to capture on my phone, I noticed a brief but unmistakable distortion, a flash of static that seemed to carry an almost deliberate pattern. I spent hours analyzing it, growing increasingly convinced that it wasn't random interference, but rather a message, a signal I couldn't decipher. My growing obsession with finding a logical explanation led me to research the building's history and the previous occupants of apartment 3B. The sparse records hinted at a man who had been described as reclusive and eccentric, but nothing concrete emerged to explain the uncanny events. In a desperate bid for clarity, I even set up a discreet camera aimed at the thin wall that separated our apartments. Late one night, the footage captured something I can scarcely bring myself to recount. In a moment of eerie stillness, the neighbor's door creaked open, and a faint, almost luminescent figure, seemingly hovering just outside the frame, drifted past his threshold. I watched in mute horror as the figure's outline seemed to blur the lines between human and something otherworldly before it vanished into the shadows of the corridor. The next day, I confronted a longtime resident in the building about these strange happenings, but the conversation ended abruptly when he muttered that some things were better left unexplained. I began to wonder if I was not only chasing my own anxieties, but also stumbling upon something far beyond ordinary human experience, a hidden layer to this seemingly mundane world. My attempts to compile a coherent body of evidence were met with frustrating gaps. Recordings that played normally one moment and then distorted into static the next, and eyewitness accounts that were as fleeting as they were inexplicable. Even as I grew more determined to uncover the truth, I found myself increasingly isolated. Friends and acquaintances began to worry about my fixation on what they dismissed as urban legends or the product of a stressed mind adjusting to a new environment. The rational part of me clung desperately to explanations that fit within the confines of everyday life, yet every new incident chipped away at that belief. Was it possible that my neighbor was merely an eccentric man haunted by his past? Or was there something else at work? An anomaly that defied conventional understanding and hinted at forces lurking just beyond the veil of the familiar? I have not resolved these questions. The tapping continues on restless nights. The mysterious lights flicker without warning, and sometimes, when I pass by that thin wall, I sense an unseen presence watching me. I remain haunted by the possibility that what I encountered was not merely a quirk of an old building or the ramblings of an overactive imagination, but rather a glimpse into a reality where the ordinary and the inexplicable intertwine. Even now, as I prepare to move out in search of a fresh start far from Elmwood, I find myself wondering if the phenomena were confined to that particular place, or if they are part of something far larger and more sinister. A truth that, like so many mysteries of our everyday lives, refuses to be neatly explained. I never believed in the supernatural until the night I discovered that my neighbor was not who, or what, I thought he was. It began subtly enough, a series of small, unexplainable events that I initially dismissed as the quirks of an old building. I had moved into a modest apartment in a nondescript complex on the edge of town about a year ago, seeking solace after a difficult breakup. The place was quiet, its corridors dimly lit, and its walls steeped in a kind of melancholy history. My neighbors were polite, if distant, and there was one particular resident whose presence unsettled me more than the others. I rarely saw him in the common areas, but his door was always slightly ajar, and on more than one occasion, I caught sight of a shadow moving behind the thin curtain that separated his apartment from the hall. At first, I chalked it up to a trick of the light or my overactive imagination, but as the weeks passed, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. One damp, wind-whipped evening, as I sat alone reading in my living room, I noticed a faint, rhythmic flickering in the window of his apartment. The light pulsed in a pattern that was almost hypnotic, a slow, deliberate cadence that sent a chill down my spine. I stared, transfixed, as the glow grew brighter, then dimmer, until it vanished entirely, leaving behind a silence that was as unnerving as it was complete. That night, my sleep was tormented by dreams of endless, maze-like corridors and whispering voices in a language I couldn't understand. I awoke to a soft scratching at my door, a sound so insistent and deliberate that I couldn't dismiss it as the groans of an old building. Peering through the peephole, I saw only a darkened hallway, yet the noise persisted, echoing in a maddening loop until I finally forced myself to bolt the door and retreat under the covers. The following days were marked by a growing series of oddities. Inexplicable cold drafts that seeped from the walls, the persistent odor of decay in the air, and faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to echo just beyond the edge of hearing. One morning, I discovered strange symbols crudely etched into the wood of my front door, symbols that resembled archaic sigils from occult lore. Desperate for a rational explanation, I began recording these events on my phone, only to find that every recording was marred by static and low, unintelligible whispers that sounded almost like incantations. Unable to ignore the mounting evidence of something amiss, I decided to dig into the history of my building and, more curiously, the elusive neighbor next door. Hidden in a dusty corner of the local library's archives, I uncovered a series of old newspaper clippings and faded journal entries about a man who had once lived in that very apartment. The accounts described him as a reclusive figure with an unsettling obsession with the occult. Rumors abounded that he had dabbled in forbidden rituals and made contact with forces beyond human comprehension. Neighbors from decades past spoke in hushed tones about strange lights, disembodied voices, and mysterious vanishings that plagued the building. The final entry in one battered journal alluded to a ritual gone horribly wrong, hinting that the man had become a vessel for something far older and more malevolent than anyone could imagine. I tried to convince myself that these were merely the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but every subsequent event in my own life only reinforced the possibility that I was now living in the shadow of that same ancient horror. One stormy night, as lightning clawed at the sky and rain battered the windows, I heard a soft, almost musical humming emanating from the direction of my neighbor's apartment. The sound was both alluring and deeply unsettling, drawing me to the window despite my better judgment. As I peered out, the reflection I saw in the pane of glass nearly made me collapse. A gaunt, spectral figure stood silhouetted against a flickering light, its eyes burning with an intensity that defied explanation. For a split second, it felt as though the figure was staring directly into my soul, and in that moment, I sensed an overwhelming, inexplicable dread. I recoiled from the window and retreated into the relative safety of my room, my heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might shatter. In the days that followed, the boundaries between night and day, reality and nightmare, began to blur. Shadows moved with a life of their own, and the echo of footsteps, sometimes mine, sometimes not, followed me incessantly down empty hallways. On more than one occasion, I caught a glimpse of that same gaunt face in the reflective surface of a window or the dark sheen of a TV screen, only for it to vanish when I turned to confront it. My attempts to alert friends and family were met with skeptical smiles and uneasy reassurances that it was merely stress or an overactive imagination. But when a friend confessed that he too had once experienced inexplicable occurrences in his previous home, a presence that had haunted his dreams and lingered in the recesses of his mind, I began to wonder if there was a more sinister explanation at work. The final straw came one night when I awoke to find my front door wide open, though I had been sure to lock it before bed. The chill of the unwelcoming air and the unmistakable scent of decay that wafted inside left me paralyzed with terror. I barricaded myself in my room, too frightened to move as I listened to the echo of soft, deliberate footsteps pacing the corridor outside. A low, almost imperceptible whisper slithered through the darkness, uttering my name over and over again in a tone that was equal parts pleading and accusing. I don't know how long I sat there, shivering in the cold, until the sound finally faded into silence. Since that night, I have tried to reclaim a sense of normalcy by moving to a new apartment, far away from the oppressive memories of that place. Yet no matter how far I run, I cannot escape the feeling that something has followed me, a relentless, unseen presence that watches from the shadows, waiting for the moment when the boundary between our world and the unknown grows perilously thin. Even now, as I write these words in the dim light of my study, I feel the weight of that lingering dread pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards and every distant, unexplained sound sets my nerves on edge, reminding me that the true horror of that time is not ended, but merely taken root in the darkest corners of my mind. I have scoured every rational explanation and sought the counsel of those who study the occult, yet nothing can dispel the nagging certainty that my neighbor was more than just a reclusive man with odd habits. He was a harbinger of something far more insidious, a manifestation of ancient forces that defy logic and reason. And although I try to convince myself that the nightmare is confined to memories of a distant past, I know that one day, the whispers may return. Until then, I remain haunted by the knowledge that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and that the true terror lies not in what we can see, but in the inexplicable void that lurks just beyond our understanding. I first noticed something off on a chilly October evening when I saw a flicker of movement at the window of the house next door. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games with my mind. The neighbor's house had always seemed unremarkable: a neat lawn, a well-maintained porch, and Mr. Henderson, a reclusive figure who rarely left his property. That night, however, as I was about to settle in for sleep, I distinctly saw a silhouette drift past his window, as if someone was watching from the shadows. I told myself it was merely a stray cat or a misinterpretation of a passing car's headlights. Yet, that small moment marked the beginning of a series of anomalies that would slowly shatter my sense of reality. In the following days, I began to notice inexplicable occurrences around my own home. Objects I had left in one place would appear in another with no logical explanation. A novel misplaced from my shelf now resting atop the kitchen counter, a set of keys mysteriously relocated to my bathroom. I found these incidents disconcerting, but brushed them off as mere absent-mindedness or the result of a mind overworked by stress. Still, a persistent unease settled in, as if my world was starting to lose its firm boundaries between what was tangible and what was not. One rainy night, while trying to force myself to sleep, I was roused by the sound of footsteps outside my window. I pulled back the curtains and saw a figure standing under the flickering light of a street lamp. The face was obscured by darkness, yet there was an eerie familiarity in the posture, a silent plea in the way the figure stood, as if waiting for something or someone. I called out hesitantly, but the figure melted into the night, leaving behind only the sound of the rain and the echo of my own racing heartbeat. I wondered if it had been a neighbor passing by or simply a manifestation of my growing paranoia. My encounters with these disturbances only grew more bizarre with time. One afternoon, while taking out the trash, I noticed an old, sepia-toned photograph peeking out from behind a stack of mail on my porch. The image depicted a man and a woman sitting on a park bench, their eyes locked in an intensity that made my skin crawl. The man bore an uncanny resemblance to me, a mirror image that I couldn't explain. I spent hours combing through old family albums and memories, trying to find any trace of a connection, but nothing surfaced. The photograph was as inexplicable as it was unsettling, an artifact of a past I was sure I'd never known. At work, my colleagues began to notice my distracted state. When I recounted the strange happenings, objects moving without explanation, fleeting encounters with mysterious figures, they dismissed them as the ramblings of an overworked mind. Yet when I mentioned the inexplicable photograph or the night's haunting footsteps, their eyes widened with a mixture of pity and thinly veiled skepticism. I started to doubt my own sanity, wondering if I was succumbing to the pressure of a life that felt increasingly surreal. Every rational thought was undermined by the recurring sensation that my reality was being quietly, insidiously rewritten. It wasn't long before the disturbances began to bleed into the realm of the impossible. One evening, I mustered the courage to knock on Mr. Henderson's door, desperate for answers about the strange occurrences in our neighborhood. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit interior that was startlingly similar to my own living room. The decor, the furniture, even the arrangement of books on a shelf. It was as if I had stepped into a distorted mirror image of my life. In the center of the room sat a single, weathered photograph of a man who looked remarkably like me. seated next to a woman I had never seen before. There was no sign of Mr. Henderson anywhere, only a suffocating silence that seemed to absorb every sound. I stumbled back into the night, my mind reeling with questions that only deepened the mystery. As autumn gave way to winter, the anomalies escalated. One night, while I was alone in my apartment, the unmistakable sound of an old, scratchy song began to play, a melody so hauntingly familiar that it tugged at buried memories I couldn't quite recall. The tune drifted through the hallways, echoing off the walls and infusing the air with a sense of foreboding. Each time I attempted to locate the source, the music would dissipate into silence, only to reappear moments later in a different part of the house. It felt as though the very fabric of my environment was shifting, rearranging itself in a pattern that defied logic. I began to wonder if the music was a call from another world, or perhaps a signal from a part of my own mind that I had long since forgotten. Sleep became a rare and elusive luxury. Night after night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks of my floorboards and the whispers of a breeze that seemed to carry voices, a murmur of names and fragments of conversation that I could almost understand. I took long, aimless walks through the neighborhood under the cover of darkness, driven by an inexplicable urge to uncover the source of these disturbances. At times, I would catch glimpses of someone in the distance, a neighbor whose face was shrouded in shadow, yet whose presence was as palpable as the chill in the air. Other times, I would see reflections in windows that didn't match the scene before me, as if a duplicate reality was overlapping with my own. The more I observed, the more I became convinced that I was caught in the crosshairs of an unseen force, one that was methodically unraveling the very essence of my reality. Now, as I sit in the dim glow of my desk lamp and scribble these final thoughts, the boundary between what is real and what is imagined has become impossibly thin. I can no longer distinguish between the fleeting visions of my neighbor and the tangible presence of my own memories. The subtle disappearance and reappearance of objects, the inexplicable photographs, the recurring whispers in the dark, they have all conspired to cast doubt on the nature of my existence. Perhaps these events are nothing more than the hallucinations of a mind on the brink, or maybe they are deliberate signals from a hidden world lurking just beyond our perception. I have no way of knowing. As the wind howls outside and the soft strains of that haunting melody fill the silence once again, I am left to wonder if I am merely a victim of my own unraveling thoughts, or if there is something far more sinister at play. With each passing moment, I can feel the fragile threads of my reality slipping further away, leaving behind only the lingering question: are these experiences real, or have they all been a figment of my imagination? I first noticed something off on an ordinary autumn evening. I had just returned home from a long day at work when I realized that my favorite set of keys was missing. At first, I assumed I'd misplaced them somewhere in my cluttered apartment, but after a frantic search and even questioning my friendly neighbor, Mr. Donovan, I began to feel an inexplicable chill. Mr. Donovan, who had always greeted me with a warm nod and a smile, now seemed oddly distant. His eyes glazed over, as if he were trying to recall something he knew was important, but couldn't quite grasp. I chalked it up to stress, until a series of minor, yet unnerving incidents began to pile up. Over the next several days, small peculiarities turned into inexplicable events. I'd find objects subtly rearranged in my living room. A book moved from the shelf to the coffee table, a pair of shoes neatly aligned by the door, even though I was certain I'd left them elsewhere. Each time I mentioned these oddities in passing, my neighbors offered half-hearted smiles and a quick change of topic, as though they were trying to erase the memory of these incidents from their minds. One afternoon, I discovered that a photograph hanging on my wall had been swapped with another nearly identical one, except the faces in it were blurred as if erased by time. The ordinary world I knew was dissolving into something unrecognizable. A week after my keys had vanished, I began noticing strange coincidences that defied logic. At the local grocery store, I overheard a conversation about a misplaced wallet, a story that mirrored my own experience with the lost keys. Yet when I mentioned it to the cashier, she frowned as if I had just fabricated the entire episode. The same neighborly confusion spread throughout the block. Conversations would halt mid-sentence whenever I walked by, leaving me with a gnawing sense that something was systematically erasing the recent past from everyone's minds. I started to wonder if it was just me, or if the fabric of our shared reality was slowly unraveling. One rainy evening, I decided to confront Mr. Donovan. I found him on his front porch, staring blankly at a street lamp as if waiting for an answer. "Have you seen my keys?" I asked, hoping for a casual explanation. He merely shook his head, his eyes void of recognition. "Some things are better left forgotten," he murmured in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. His words, vague and heavy with implication, echoed in my mind long after I left. That night, I lay awake listening to the patter of rain against my window, my thoughts swirling with disquieting possibilities. Could it be that my own memories were not as reliable as I'd always believed? The strangest part was how slowly the changes crept in. I began to notice that my own actions felt automated, as though I were watching a film of my life rather than actively participating in it. I'd find myself on a familiar route to the corner store, only to later realize I couldn't recall why I had gone there in the first place. When I tried to speak about these lapses with others, their responses were curt and dismissive, as if the memories I clung to had been purged from the communal consciousness. Even the digital clock in my living room seemed to tick in irregular patterns, and on several occasions, I swear it rewound a few seconds before continuing normally, leaving me questioning if time itself had become unreliable. It wasn't long before I began to see disturbing changes in the people around me. One afternoon, while walking past a neighbor's open window, I caught sight of a reflection, a figure standing behind me that moved in perfect unison with my own steps. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, only to find the street empty. In another instance, a woman I'd known for years started recounting an event from earlier that day, only to completely contradict her own story minutes later. It was as if the narrative of our shared experiences was being rewritten in real time, leaving me stranded in a loop of forgotten moments. I increasingly felt like a bystander, watching my life fragment and slip away, while everyone around me seemed to be operating under a different set of rules. Desperate for answers, I began to scour old records and local history. I unearthed tales of residents who had mysteriously lost memories, of nights when entire blocks were shrouded in a fog of collective amnesia. Every lead I followed ended in a dead end, and every time I attempted to discuss my findings with someone in the neighborhood, I was met with blank stares or a quick dismissal. I even encountered an old, dusty journal in the attic of my apartment building that spoke cryptically about the slow erasure of what once was and a presence that slips in between memories. The words were scrawled in a hurried hand, as if the writer had been consumed by an urgent need to warn others, only to vanish before the message could be fully understood. Late one night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. I crept to the peephole and saw a shadow moving along the corridor, a figure that was unmistakably human, yet its outline wavered like a mirage. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, but a faint, inexplicable chill lingered in the air. The unsettling sensation that I was being watched by unseen eyes clung to me relentlessly. My own reflection in the hallway mirror began to distort, stretching and bending, as if it were trying to communicate a secret too dreadful to reveal. I couldn't shake the feeling that every step I took was orchestrated by forces far beyond my understanding, forces that were deliberately erasing the trace of every moment, every memory. Now, as I sit here trying to piece together the remnants of what once felt like a normal life, I'm left with a persistent, haunting question. Is this all in my head, a cascade of misremembered events fueled by isolation and mounting paranoia? Or is something else at work, manipulating the very essence of reality? The neighborhood, with its fading recollections and distorted reflections, feels like a stage set for a play where the script is being rewritten in real time, and I am merely an unwilling extra in a performance whose ending I cannot predict. I can no longer be sure if the shifts in time, the lost objects, and the altered faces of those I once knew are figments of my deteriorating mind, or if there's an unseen puppeteer orchestrating this slow, insidious unraveling. As the line between memory and oblivion blurs, I wonder if I will ever reclaim control over my life, or if I am doomed to exist as a silent witness to a reality that continuously reshapes itself beyond my grasp.